everyone, and now we get to one of my favorite sections whenever we talk about a different time period, the literature. For the next few minutes, I'll be speaking to you about Old English literature. For every historical unit in this class, we'll have a lecture about the period's literature. While the literature itself will always be translated into modern English, we can still examine stylistic elements to get a better grasp of how language was used in the period. It may be difficult for some of you to focus your literary analysis solely to the use of the language, but I think it'll be an instructive and ultimately useful challenge. We don't have audio recordings of how English sounded for Old, Middle, or Early Modern English, so the written texts are the closest things we have to historical record of language use, so we'll use them. We don't have very much Old English literature, at least not compared to later periods of English. In fact, we've probably only found a fraction of all of the period's literature due to things like Viking raids and the dissolution of monasteries and, time. Many of the manuscripts have been lost, but what we see in the fragments that remain is fascinating. We see a mixture of regional elements, we see a mixture of dialects, although the majority of texts are written in West Saxon due to Alfred's influence, remember Alfred the Great. Because of the dominance of West Saxon and the preservation of archaic features, it can be quite difficult or impossible to pin down Old English versus original production date or location. Another thing, when we read Old English verse or poetry, we have to remember that this was first an oral culture. They spoke before they wrote. And so many of the markers of orality are preserved in the transcripts of the poems. While Anglo-Saxon culture highly valued their poets and their work, another thing to remember, most of the authors of Old English manuscripts, unknown. And so it's a very kind of mysterious period for literary study. Old English poetry had a very distinct diction. And you'll understand what I mean by that when we finish looking at the literature of the section. Old English writers also really enjoyed alliteration. So remember, they're an oral culture, and so the alliteration would have created patterns that helped poets remember hundreds of lines of poetry. These writers also really enjoyed wordplay, so bawdy, suggestive, or lewd innuendo were a favorite, especially puns, which I think is weird, but whatevs. The Old English called this writing skill wordum rixlin, which meant to weave words together. The fragments of Old English literature that we have are mainly poems, elegiac or commemorative poems, charms, and riddles. The earliest texts from the period date back to 700 CE. However, this is after England was introduced to Christianity. So what we see then is Christian elements being added to pagan heroic texts, and more overtly verse based on biblical material. Perhaps the most important collection of documents in Old English for linguistic purposes is this called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. These documents may have originated as Easter tables, which were annals used by the clergy to determine the date on which Easter fell each year. But soon the Chronicle detailed entries depicting the major events of each year. There are seven versions of the Chronicle compiled in different places and quite divergent in the events they record. But up until 891, all of them seem to have had a common source, perhaps in southwest England, prompting the thought that King Alfred, and remember, he wanted to promote literacy, and so a lot of people, this prompted the thought that he commissioned them. The last chronicle, the one kept in Petersborough, records events through the year 1154. The Chronicles are important linguistically because they constitute a record of Old English over a long period of time, allowing us to observe changes in the language, especially in the later Chronicles. Because the Chronicles are not translations from Latin either, their prose is unaffected by Latin style. Its prose is of a plain native kind, the written language in its most straightforward manifestation. In fact, one of the two battles between the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings served as the basis for an epic war poem, and the Battle of Brunanburh was contained in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Okay, and it talked a little bit about military conflict and awe and respect inherent in Old Norse sagas. One of the people we need to look at is Bede, or the Venerable Bede, as he was historically referred to. He was a Northumbrian monk who was raised at the monastery at Jarrow. He eventually came to be respected as a scholarly source throughout Western Europe, primarily for his text, Ecclesiastical History of the English People, the account of how a cowherd received poetic skills through divine intervention is given in this text, where Bede asserts that Caedmon was the first to write religious poetry in English, and quotes the sense of this first poem, but not the order of the words, since this cannot be rendered in Latin. Many manuscripts, however, quote the English version of what has become known as Caedmon's Hymn, which was part of Bede's ecclesiastical history. The verbal ordering to which Bede referred is worth noticing, for it's generally characteristic of Old English verse style. The line is divided syntactically and metrically into two halves, linked by alliteration. There's no rhyme. Within the structure of the line, a sense of balance arises from the two half lines, and the subject matter unfolds in a partially repetitive way. Semantically, related words and phrases are balanced against one another, creating the characteristic effect of parallelism, of sense and structure with variation and expression. Okay. Bede's work was selected for translation by Alfred the Great. Another person we want to look at is Alfred. Alfred is one of a handful of Anglo-Saxon authors whose name is known to us. He was a priest and a monk who lived all his life in Wessex. After teaching in the monastic school in Winchester, he proceeded to the monastery at Cerne Abbas, Dorset, where his Catholic homilies were written between about 986 and 992. In 1005, he became abbot of the new monastery at Eynsham in Oxfordshire. His purpose, the reason he wrote the homilies, he explains, is to make the essential teachings of the church available in simple terms to those incapable of understanding Latin. So a lot of people didn't know Latin, and so he wrote his homilies down so they could understand the word according to the church. Ethelwood, to whose school Alfred belonged, had a particular interest in literacy, and his Winchester school developed certain characteristic verbal choices which are exemplified in Alfred's writings. More significantly, a relatively consistent way of writing West Saxon was developed, which through its adoption by royal clerks, became used beyond the West Saxon dialect area by others writing in English. Alfred's work, De Temporibus Anni, contains an account of creation. Knowledge of cosmology was introductory to an understanding of astronomy, and this was of importance in medieval monasteries since the computation of the calendar was based upon it, right? So this in turn made possible the certain identification of religious feast days. Characteristically, Alfred appends an allegorical and moral interpretation to the natural science he recounts. This piece of writing, or scientific writing at that, illustrates quite well some of the features of Alfred's earlier prose style. Simple, non-Latin vocabulary, phrasal repetition and sequences to help people remember, and phrases syntactically and semantically balanced and contrasted. Remember, he wanted to make sure that as many people as possible could understand his teachings. There are many other significant texts in the period, but in this lecture I've tried to focus on the text we'll be reading in translation. Beowulf and the Dream of the Rood, you've probably familiar with. They talk a little bit about it in your book. Other things that we can find from Old English literature, we find legal documents, we find practical works on grammar, medicine, and geography. We find, of course, religious writings, and we find translations from Latin. And while we won't be looking at them, historians find these practical texts, translations, and religious writings to be incredibly useful in understanding the way Old English writers understood and employed the language. Okay, so this week we covered Old English. Next week we are moving to Middle English, and things are going to pick up a little bit because Middle English is when kind of we start seeing the language that we are more familiar with today. So I'm excited for that. I hope you're excited for that. If you have any questions about any of the information in this lecture or in this entire unit on Old English, please email me, call me, come find me, and we'll talk about it. Have a great day.